Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
The last time I saw Derek Rollins smirk, he was standing in the middle of what used to be my office, arms crossed like he owned the air in the room, with that same rehearsed arrogance he'd worn since college. Only this time, there was nothing endearing about it. He didn't flinch when he leaned against my desk, the one he'd once helped me assemble back when we were building something together before he decided demolition was more fun. He looked around casually, as if surveying damage he had nothing to do with, and when I mentioned the missing invoices, the canceled supplier contracts, and the client who suddenly ghosted after 3 months of negotiation, he shrugged, raised one eyebrow, and said, "They'll make you forgive me like always." No hint of apology, no recognition of the wreckage he'd caused. Just that damned smirk, like my ruin was just another one of his weekend projects. I stayed quiet. But something shifted in that silence, something permanent. You have to understand that this wasn't the first time Derek had set something of mine on fire and handed me the ashes like they were flowers. When we were married, he had a gift for cutting corners and slipping through loopholes with the charm of a man who never had to face consequences. He wasn't evil, not in the movie villain way, but in the quiet, insidious way that makes you question your own anger. He never hit me, never screamed, never cheated, at least not in bed, but he cheated in other ways, on taxes, on contracts, on boundaries, and when I caught him, he smiled, apologized with a speech so convincing it made me feel guilty for having been upset in the first place. That was his art, rewriting the story while you were still living in it. But that was then. That was before I pulled myself out of the wreckage of our divorce and built Grant & Comtois from the ground up, an interior design firm that didn't just survive in a cutthroat market, but actually thrived, despite every whispered doubt from people who thought I'd crumble without his help. For 4 years, I worked double time, took on side projects at night, networked like a politician on a campaign trail, and learned to make peace with being underestimated. It was exhausting, humiliating at times, but it was mine. And then, one Thursday morning in May, my phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't expected. A flagged tax audit. I assumed it was a mistake, until I logged into our QuickBooks account and saw several transactions that didn't match my records. All of them tied to one name, Derek Rollins. It wasn't just one charge, it was a string of them. Small at first, just enough to slide under any system's radar. A catering order here, a travel reimbursement there. But then came a vendor deposit I never authorized, signed with a digital signature that wasn't mine. And then another, and another. Together, they formed a puzzle I couldn't unsee. Derek had used old login credentials to quietly reroute funds, impersonate approvals, and sabotage deals from the inside out, all while maintaining just enough distance to claim innocence if things went sideways. It was elegant in a sick way. He hadn't touched the core of my business, just the limbs, the fingers that held deals together, the toes that kept us balanced. And now I was hobbling, bleeding cash, and staring down the barrel of a federal audit. When I confronted him stupidly face to face in the office he had no right to enter, he didn't deny any of it. He just smiled, leaned back against my desk like he was lounging on a beach chair, and said the words that still echo when I close my eyes at night. "They'll make you forgive me like always." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as a human being and started seeing him as a pattern I needed to break. Not because I wanted revenge, not yet, but because I finally realized what he saw when he looked at me. He didn't see a woman with a business and a backbone. He saw the same girl he'd married, the one who used to make excuses for his mistakes to their friends, who once begged the bank to reverse a charge he'd accidentally made to the joint account for a trip I never took. He thought I still played that role. He thought I'd still choose peace over confrontation. He thought I hadn't changed. But he hadn't been around to see what rock bottom looked like when I had to call my staff into a room and tell them we couldn't make payroll that month. He hadn't seen the shaking hands I used to sign the loan extension that kept us afloat. He didn't see me when I cried in the car for 20 minutes after losing our biggest client because of a double-booked delivery he had engineered behind the scenes. He only saw the version of me who took the blame and kept smiling, so I smiled back. I told him I'd look into it, that maybe it was just a glitch. I told him I appreciated his concern and that it was just nice to see a familiar face. And he lapped it up like a dog being handed table scraps. He even said something on the way out about how he was glad we could talk like adults. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a bottle of red wine, a legal pad, and my laptop open to every digital account tied to my company, and I made a list. A long, brutal list of every digital fingerprint he'd left behind, every email header, every document timestamp, every invoice that bore his handwriting, every Slack message where he inserted himself into conversations as if he still had a role. And I didn't just write them down for myself. I compiled them into a timeline. I sent it to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. Her name was Kendra. We met in college. She was the one who never put up with Derek's charm, even when the rest of our circle laughed along with him. She became a lawyer, the kind who read contracts like novels and could smell a fraud before he stepped into the room. We hadn't spoken in months, but when I forwarded her that file, she called me within an hour. No pleasantries, just one sentence. You want to burn him quietly or publicly? I told her I hadn't decided yet. Because revenge isn't about theatrics. Not when the audience already thinks you're the villain for not smiling through the sabotage. Not when your employees are nervous. Not when your accountant won't return your calls. Revenge, when it's necessary, needs to be clean, surgical, untraceable until it's too late. And Derek? He wouldn't even know it had started. But it had. And I wasn't going to stop until that smirk of his was a memory. It's a strange thing, really, how someone can dismantle your livelihood piece by piece, and yet somehow still walk into a room like they deserve applause just for showing up. Like their presence alone is a gift you should be grateful for, even if everything they've ever touched in your life eventually broke in their hands, or worse, burned to ash, while they made you believe it was your fault for handing it to them in the first place. Derek had that talent. He could convince a room full of rational adults that fire wasn't fire, that smoke was just a suggestion, and that any damage done could be smoothed over with a smile and a few well-placed words about intentions and miscommunication, as if the intention to sabotage somehow made the sabotage less real, less painful, or less expensive. A week had passed since the audit notice and his casual confession, and in that week I'd managed to pretend, beautifully I might add, that I was just another woman who didn't want to make waves, another ex-wife still willing to be civil, another business owner who thought maybe if she just stayed calm and quiet, the storm would pass without wrecking everything she'd built. And that was exactly what Derek expected. Because in his world, people didn't confront. At least not women like me. Women like me were supposed to take a breath, forgive the oversight, maybe even share the blame, and then carry on because disruption wasn't good for business. And being difficult never looked good in the mirror. So I gave him what he expected, or more accurately, I gave him the performance of a lifetime. I responded to his emails with polite, vague curiosity, pretending I wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but would certainly look into it, as though I were just confused by a few numbers rather than standing in a financial crime scene he had personally orchestrated. I even invited him to lunch under the pretense of discussing strategic opportunities, which, of course, stroked his ego so thoroughly that he didn't question it for a second. He showed up in a navy jacket I had bought for him 3 Christmases ago with his usual cologne and that annoying little laugh he always gave when he ordered something expensive and expected me to raise an eyebrow. He still believed, deep in that pit of narcissism he called a soul, that I needed him, that some part of me was still clinging to the fantasy that we could be partners again, whether in business or something murkier and more self-serving. Over steak and wine that I paid for, he launched into a monologue about how he had been thinking of getting back into the game, as if he hadn't just spent the last year swindling people through shell companies and living off the residual charm of a man who used to host client golf outings but hadn't earned a single honest dollar since our divorce. He mentioned a few contacts, names I recognized from my own network, and dropped hints about wanting to collaborate or co-brand, testing the waters like a predator circling the edge of the pool. I nodded along, offered just enough agreement to keep him talking, and asked thoughtful questions that made it look like I was considering opening a door. I wasn't. I was bricking it shut behind him, one line of polite conversation at a time. What he didn't know, what he never once considered, was that every word coming out of his mouth was being transcribed by an app on my phone, sitting right beside the breadbasket, and that every hypothetical he casually suggested about how we might move money between accounts or how it's not really fraud if nobody reports it was being collected and time-stamped in real time. He didn't know that I had already begun quietly reconnecting with the clients he'd tried to poach through burner emails and private back channels, or that I had screenshotted every LinkedIn message he'd sent using my name as leverage. He didn't know that I had hired a tech consultant to trace the IP address from which those phony invoices had been created, nor that the bank had flagged a recent withdrawal made from a joint business account that was, legally speaking, frozen the moment he signed the divorce papers. But most of all, he didn't know that Kendra, my lawyer, the one who didn't believe in half measures, had already prepared a cease and desist order with enough teeth to draw blood, and that we were simply waiting for him to make one more mistake, one more brazen comment, one more digital misstep before we launched the kind of legal retaliation that doesn't just burn bridges, it burns careers. Derek's charm had always been his weapon, but now it was my shield, because the more he talked, the more he believed I was still under his spell, the more he relaxed and revealed. And that's how predators go down. Not in a dramatic gunshot moment, but in a slow-motion realization that the prey they were toying with was never prey at all, just a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment came, oddly enough, the next morning in a coffee shop, where I usually went to clear my head. I wasn't there for Derek, not directly. I was there to meet someone else, a supplier rep named Caroline, who had mysteriously stopped taking my calls 2 weeks earlier, right after we'd finalized a delivery agreement that would have doubled my margins on mid-range installs. She looked nervous, even hesitant, when she saw me, as though she expected a confrontation. But what she gave me instead was confirmation, a forwarded email from someone calling himself Operations Manager, using an address registered to a fake domain, suspiciously similar to mine, requesting that the contract be transferred to a better positioned third party. The email was signed DR and dated the same day I had sent Caroline a thank you note for our finalized deal. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I just asked her if she would be willing to forward the email thread to my legal team. She hesitated, of course she did. But when I assured her that this wasn't about revenge, that it was about protecting everyone else from being dragged into something ugly and dishonest, she agreed. And that was it. That was the piece I needed to move from observation to action. Back at home, I opened my laptop, added the email to the evidence timeline, and drafted a reply to Derek. Just one sentence, nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just a simple confirmation that we were on the same page, and I looked forward to future discussions. He responded within 20 minutes, still oblivious, still smug, still underestimating me. But I was done being underestimated. The next time he saw me, I would not be offering lunch or a polite smile. The next time he saw me, I would be handing him a document he couldn't charm his way out of, with a signature that made it very clear I wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not this time. Not ever again. It started with a seemingly harmless question from Harper, the kind of question you'd usually brush off with a half answer because it came from someone too junior to be dangerous, too new to be in the loop, and too fresh to understand how deeply tangled things really were behind the scenes. But something in the way she asked it made me stop mid-sentence, because it wasn't just curiosity in her voice. It was calculation, precision, and a subtle kind of sharpness I recognized instantly, not from resumes or interview folders, but from experience, from the version of myself that had emerged after Derek had finished reshaping my life into something unrecognizable and expected me to thank him for it. She had asked, quite plainly, if I had meant to authorize a vendor payment that didn't match the invoice amount in our system. A routine task, the kind of oversight that happens when people are rushing. And yet her tone was too focused, her timing too specific, and her phrasing too crisp for it to be an accidental observation. When I looked up from my laptop and saw her holding the file, not on her phone, not on her computer, but in printed form with highlighted lines and tabs, I realized two things at once. First, she was smarter than I'd given her credit for, and second, she wasn't working for me in the way I had assumed. She was working with me, and not just as an intern. I found out later, much later, that Harper had come recommended not through the usual job boards or school partnerships, but through Kendra, who had met her at a networking event for women in law and business, and had tucked her name away for a moment. When someone like me, someone under siege and surrounded by sharks, might need a quiet, observant ally capable of playing dumb while documenting everything. And Harper had done just that. She had kept her head down, taken notes no one asked for, filed duplicates of invoices into folders no one double-checked, and mirrored every change in our cloud system into a private drive she never accessed from the office network. She had built a parallel skeleton of our business, clean, time-stamped, undeniable, and by the time she showed me that mismatched invoice, the trap was already closed. The invoice itself was almost perfect. A payment to a logistics firm we had worked with twice before, nothing unusual on the surface. The bank transfer had been processed using our company's standard form template, with my digital signature attached, and the routing matched what was on file. But the amount was off by just enough to raise suspicion, $5,700 instead of $4,300. And that was enough to trigger Harper's attention because she had reviewed the vendor's previous quotes and noticed the same padding applied to 3 other payments, all tied to urgent delivery charges that weren't listed in the original terms. She'd checked the timestamps, and although they had technically cleared the accounting system, the authorization metadata showed they were signed from an IP address not located in the office, or even in the state. When she showed me the details, I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything in me, every muscle, every breath, every shard of anger I had learned to bury, snapped into clarity. I knew exactly what Derek had done, and I knew in a sudden rush of grim satisfaction that he had finally made the mistake I had been waiting for. He had stopped being careful. He had let his ego outpace his caution, and now there was no turning back. I thanked Harper, not with a speech or an emotional outburst, but with something quieter and far more honest. A long silence, a nod, and the kind of eye contact that says, "You're not just an intern anymore." From that moment forward, I let her in on the full picture. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to let her understand that what we were doing was no longer about fixing an accounting error or cleaning up a vendor mess. We were going after someone who had operated like a ghost, a shadow in systems we thought were secure, someone who had built his entire strategy on the assumption that we'd be too overwhelmed, too distracted, too tired to connect the dots. But we had connected them. And now it was time to start making him panic. The first step was simple. Let him feel safe. I forwarded a message to Derek later that afternoon, thanking him for his recent insight into operational budgeting and letting him know we had discovered a minor accounting issue that was already under review by internal staff. It was bait, pure and simple, wrapped in politeness, and typed with a straight face. I even CC'd a fake compliance officer email, an address Harper had created that looked like a corporate oversight account, just to make him believe the issue had been flagged, but not traced to him. Predictably, he responded with feigned concern, asking if there was anything he could do, and suggesting he double-check a few things on his end just to be thorough. He still believed he was in the clear, still thought I was clueless, still imagined I was giving him a heads up so he could cover his tracks. What he didn't know, what made it all so satisfying, was that his double-checking efforts were being logged in real time by our cybersecurity consultant, who was tracing his login patterns and screen activity through dummy accounts we had left active just for this purpose. Every document he touched, every page he visited, every system window he minimized and reopened was recorded, time-stamped, and archived in a master folder labeled Rollins, Active Exposure, and then came the envelope. I didn't hand it to him in person, of course. That would have been too dramatic, too messy. Instead, I had it delivered by courier to his new office, if you could even call it that, a shared co-working space on the edge of downtown that looked more like a Starbucks with good lighting than a place where legitimate business was conducted. Inside the envelope was a letter, neither hostile nor accusing, just official, stating that due to multiple discrepancies in recent transactions, the board of Grant & Company had voted to pursue an independent audit of all past collaborations with former staff members, particularly those who had retained access to financial systems post-employment. The tone was distant. The wording was calm. But the message was unmistakable. That was the first blow. Not the lawsuit, not the legal notice, not even the threat of jail time. Just the suggestion that his actions were no longer hidden. And later that night, when I saw the red receipt ping on the file we'd planted with false data that would flag him the moment he opened it, I didn't smile. I just whispered to myself, now he knows. But he still had no idea what was coming next. By the time Derek texted me to check in later that week, his usual veneer of control had started to fray, though not enough for a stranger to notice. Only someone like me, someone who had spent years decoding the subtext behind every one of his carefully punctuated sentences, every strategically timed message, and every innocuous question disguised as a casual check-in. He wrote, "Hey, just making sure everything's okay with that invoice stuff. I'd hate for there to be any confusion." There was no urgency in the words themselves, nothing overtly suspicious, but I knew that behind the screen he was sweating bullets, pacing some rented office with a cup of overpriced coffee in hand, replaying every move he had made in the last 3 months and wondering if I had found the thread, and if I had already started pulling. What he didn't realize, what men like Derek never seem to grasp until it's far too late, is that silence is not the absence of action. It is often the very disguise of it. And in my case, my silence wasn't just strategic, it was surgical. Because while he was still pretending to be helpful, still suggesting we get coffee soon, still believing I was only beginning to piece things together, the paperwork had already been filed. The financial forensics had already been compiled into a neat, damning package. And the letterhead on the legal notice had already been printed with the sharp, uncompromising font of a law firm that specialized in business litigation and reputational collapse. I let him wait 2 more days before I responded. Not because I needed time, I had already memorized every angle of the case, but because I wanted the silence to gnaw at him, to make him imagine 100 different versions of what I might be doing, and more importantly, who I might be talking to. When I finally replied, I kept it short, not out of brevity, but because brevity, in moments like these, carries weight. I wrote, "Appreciate the concern. The matter's already been forwarded to legal. I assume your lawyer has received the notice by now." I sent it at 8:02 in the morning, just as the workday began, ensuring that he'd read it before he'd had a chance to armor himself with denials or distractions. And when I saw the read receipt ping less than 5 minutes later, I didn't follow up. I didn't answer his call. I didn't respond to the flurry of messages that came next, each one gradually escalating in tone, from concern to confused, from confused to defensive, from defensive to something that resembled panic dressed up as indignation. Because when a man like Derek feels the walls closing in, he doesn't confront, at least not directly. He tries to renegotiate reality. He gaslights the timeline. He asks questions he already knows the answers to, hoping you'll second-guess your own memory of events. His messages said things like, "Wait, what notice?" And, "Is this really necessary?" And Surely we can handle this like adults. As if we hadn't already tried that route, back when I still believed in logic and he still believed I was harmless. But it was the fourth message that told me everything I needed to know, not about the case, but about his state of mind. It read, "Melissa, come on, we've both made mistakes here." That was Derek's tell. That's what he always said when he knew he'd gone too far, when he needed to reframe the narrative just enough to keep himself from falling face first into the consequences he'd earned. But this time, I didn't bite. Because this time, I wasn't trying to win the argument. I was ending the story. By the following Monday, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, the kind with cold water bottles lined up in the center and a printer humming faintly in the corner, as Kendra laid out the final steps of the litigation process. She didn't ask me if I was sure. She didn't remind me how exhausting court battles can be. She simply handed me a folder thick with signed affidavits, client testimonies, vendor statements, and server logs with Derek's fingerprints all over them. "We're ready," she said, and I believed her. Meanwhile, Harper, who had long since proven herself to be far more than an intern, was wrapping up the final pieces of the internal report, which we had packaged and time-stamped for a possible press release if Derek tried to deny anything publicly. I had no intention of going that route unless he forced my hand. But knowing I had every receipt, every email, every voice recording, and every altered document in my possession, gave me the kind of quiet confidence I had never felt while standing across from him before. This wasn't about power, this was about truth, and the simple crushing weight of it once it was fully revealed. The next time I saw Derek in person, the atmosphere had changed so completely that I could hardly recognize him. We crossed paths at a networking event, a charity gala for local business owners, the kind of event where everything is all white wine and fake laughs. But the moment he saw me walk in, the color drained from his face so visibly I almost pitied him. Almost. He was standing next to a group of people, mid-sentence, holding a glass he hadn't touched. And when our eyes met, he tried to recover by flashing that same rehearsed smirk, the one he always wore like armor, but it didn't reach his eyes this time, and it didn't land the way it used to. I didn't walk over, I didn't make a scene, I didn't need to. All I did was meet his gaze, let it hold for just a moment longer than was comfortable, and then turn toward the keynote speaker like he wasn't even there. Because the truth is, Derek wasn't there. Not really, not anymore. He was already crumbling behind the scenes, trying to manage the fallout with a legal team that knew he had walked into this mess with his eyes wide open, trying to maintain relationships with clients who had begun pulling back without explanation, and trying to convince himself that he could still fix this, even as the rope slipped tighter with every hour he failed to act. That night, I received one final message from him. No punctuation, no signature, just 5 desperate words. "Can we talk about this?" I didn't reply, because this wasn't something to talk about anymore. This was something to watch unfold. And Derek? He was finally starting to understand what silence really sounds like. It wasn't the courtroom or the signatures or the stern faces of opposing counsel that gave me the deepest sense of resolution, nor was it the moment I saw Derek sitting across the negotiation table, hunched slightly forward, his hands clasped so tightly they looked pale at the knuckles, trying to play composed while his entire posture betrayed a man who had run out of angles, out of stories, out of backup plans to pivot toward. No, the true moment of reckoning came long after the formalities were over, after the attorneys had shaken hands, after the financial settlements had been logged, after the assets had been frozen and reallocated, and the investigative paperwork had disappeared into the thick manila files of government compliance officers who would spend the next several months quietly building the secondary case Derek still didn't know was coming. It came in the stillness of my office, as I stood by the window watching the first snow of the season drift over the streetlights like powdered glass, realizing not just that I had survived him, but that I had won in the only way that mattered, without ever sinking to the level he always counted on, without ever playing the part of the vindictive ex, the hysterical woman, or the reckless business owner too emotional to stay strategic. The day the settlement was finalized, there was no dramatic outburst, no shouting match, no smug final comment on Derek's part. And that silence, unlike the ones before, wasn't a pause before another manipulation. It was the silence of defeat, heavy and final and utterly inescapable. He had walked in expecting options, expecting leniency, maybe even expecting one last opportunity to spin a story in his favor. But what he found instead was a complete, airtight record of every action he had taken, every signature he had forged, every dollar he had diverted, all delivered in the calm, measured voice of my legal team as they outlined the consequences of each step. There was nothing left for him to say. His lawyer, a man who had clearly not been given the full picture before walking into that room, kept glancing over at him, probably wondering how much of what he was hearing was exaggerated, until the documents spoke for themselves, until the timeline was too precise to deny, until Harper's name came up in the witness list with enough digital evidence to bury any counter-argument. Afterwards, Derek didn't approach me, didn't try to argue, didn't even look me in the eye. He stood in the hallway outside the conference room for a full minute after the rest of us had left, probably trying to figure out where it had all slipped beyond his control, and I watched him through the glass for a moment, just long enough to see the way he pulled out his phone, stared at it like it might save him, then slid it back into his pocket without dialing anyone, as though some part of him finally understood that there were no more quick fixes, no more easy outs, no more women waiting in the wings to clean up his messes and carry the burden of his charm. But what lingered, what stayed with me far longer than any legal victory or professional satisfaction, was the conversation that followed a week later, a phone call I wasn't expecting from a number I didn't recognize, answered more out of habit than curiosity. The voice on the other end was calm, almost apologetic, and it took me a moment to realize who it was. A new lawyer representing Derek, a replacement for the one who had clearly jumped ship after seeing the wreckage up close. He said, "He asked me to reach out, not with a legal matter, but with a personal message. He says you still owe him the truth." I didn't respond at first, not because I didn't have words, but because I had too many, too complex and layered to express through the filter of a stranger relaying someone else's grasp for closure. I wanted to ask which truth he was referring to, the truth about the damage he caused, the lies he told, the trust he twisted like a weapon, or maybe the truth about how long I had waited for him to be someone he was never going to be. But instead, I just said, "There's nothing left to explain," and ended the call because some truths aren't owed, not after the final chapter has already been written in ink. And that's the part people don't talk about when they romanticize revenge or justice or empowerment. They forget that real closure doesn't come with applause or headlines or someone admitting they were wrong. It comes with restraint, with discipline, with waking up in the morning and realizing you no longer feel the urge to prove anything to anyone. It comes with rebuilding, quietly, deliberately, on ground that used to be scorched, and finding that you're still capable of planting something new. In the months that followed, my business stabilized, not quickly, not without hiccups, but steadily. Clients returned, slowly at first, then more confidently, and word began to spread that I was not just still standing, but stronger, sharper, and no longer as accommodating to people who mistook kindness for weakness. Harper accepted a full-time position, and Kendra and I started mentoring a small group of young women in business law and ethics, a project that came not from vengeance, but from the clarity that grows in the aftermath of manipulation. I never told the full story publicly, never made a spectacle of it, because I didn't need to. Those who mattered knew enough, and those who didn't never deserved to. Sometimes I still see Derek's name in emails, forwarded warnings from others, or odd networking alerts from long-forgotten platforms where his profile still lingers. Like an outdated ghost. I never open them. I don't need to. His story ended where mine began again, not with a scream or a confrontation, but with the quiet power of a woman who learned that forgiveness is not a favor owed to the unrepentant. And that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness, but the loudest message of all. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not destruction, it is irrelevance.